Nick Hunt had always dreamed of living somewhere peaceful, where the only things he needed to worry about were the changing seasons and the maintenance of his small but carefully curated property. After nearly 2 decades managing a mid-sized construction equipment rental company, Nick decided it was time to step away from the daily grind and invest in a quieter, more deliberate life. His search for the perfect house led him to a charming, somewhat aging community just beyond the city limits. A patchwork of traditional homes, mature oak trees, and winding roads that seemed almost frozen in time. The neighborhood was run by a homeowners committee, but when Nick purchased his lot, he was assured by his realtor that his property fell just outside the association's official boundaries. To Nick, it was the ideal arrangement, close enough to civilization to enjoy basic amenities, but isolated enough that he could enjoy privacy without interference. At first, things went smoothly. Nick spent his first 6 months renovating the house with his own 2 hands, pouring concrete for a sturdier driveway, updating the cracked porch, and meticulously restoring the overgrown garden. He worked quietly, minding his own business, not looking to ruffle any feathers. The neighbors, though distant, were generally polite. Some waved when they passed by. A few even stopped to compliment his efforts at revitalizing the property. Nick didn't see any reason to get involved with local politics or community events. He wasn't antisocial. He just valued his independence and saw no need for unnecessary entanglements. For a time, it seemed he had found exactly what he was looking for. However, tensions began to rise almost imperceptibly. It started with subtle comments from Karen Miller, the self-appointed president of the homeowners committee, a heavyset woman in her late 50s, known for her pastel-colored pantsuits and clipped, officious tone. At a seasonal meet and greet, where Nick had been invited mostly out of courtesy, Karen cornered him near the refreshments table and casually remarked that his freshly repaved driveway, while very handsome, might not be entirely compliant with the community's aesthetic guidelines. Nick, who knew full well that no such guidelines could touch his property, simply smiled and said he'd look into it. He thought little of it at the time, chalking it up to overzealous neighborly advice. Over the next few months, the passive-aggressive encounters multiplied. Karen would drop by while Nick was working outside to comment on his choice of paint colors, the height of his new fence posts, or even the placement of his garbage cans. Other committee members, once friendly or indifferent, became cooler toward him, often avoiding eye contact or offering terse, uncomfortable greetings. Nick, for his part, refused to engage in confrontation. He kept his paperwork in order, carefully documenting every permit, every repair, and every compliance inspection related to his property. He knew that when you lived near busybodies, the smartest move was to be unassailable. That spring, Nick received an unexpected letter. It was an official-looking notice from the homeowners committee, congratulating him on his acceptance into the community's maintenance program and informing him that an annual fee of $15,000 would now be assessed against his property. The letter was written in the syrupy language of bureaucratic courtesy, but its implication was clear: pay up or face consequences. Nick set the letter down, read it again, and laughed aloud at the absurdity. His property was excluded from their governance. The realtor had verified it. The title paperwork confirmed it. There was no mechanism by which the committee could simply adopt his lot because it suited them. Still, Nick understood better than to ignore such a move. He immediately contacted a property attorney to review the situation. The lawyer was amused but thorough, confirming Nick's understanding and drafting a formal letter to the committee politely declining their offer and reminding them that they had no jurisdiction over his land. Nick sent the letter by certified mail, kept copies of everything, and went on with his life, believing that would be the end of it. Karen, however, was not someone who liked to be contradicted, and certainly not publicly. Nick's refusal became a matter of personal offense to her, something that simmered quietly among the committee's internal meetings. Though Nick had no access to the closed-door discussions, he could sense the shift in atmosphere whenever he passed through the neighborhood. Where once there had been casual nods, now there were thin smiles and averted gazes. He saw Karen's pale green sedan drive by his house a little too often, the glint of her sunglasses visible even from the cover of his front porch. He noticed that city inspectors began visiting his street more frequently, though none ever cited him for violations. He saw his mailbox, once untouched, become occasionally stuffed with junk flyers advertising approved contractors, affiliated with the homeowners committee. Nick understood what was happening. It was a soft siege, a campaign not of direct aggression but of attrition, designed to make him weary, to push him toward compliance simply out of exhaustion. Yet Nick was a stubborn man, made stubborn not by pride, but by principle. He had worked too hard, too long, to carve out a piece of freedom for himself to now surrender it to the petty empire of a suburban tyrant. He fortified his resolve, continued tending his land, kept meticulous records of every interaction, every odd occurrence, every vehicle parked suspiciously near his driveway. He treated it like what it was, not a feud with neighbors, but a slow-moving territorial dispute where preparation and patience would decide the outcome. Still, Nick was not prepared for what came next. It happened in the early hours of a Sunday morning. Nick, sipping his coffee on the porch, noticed something strange as he looked toward the road. His driveway, the very artery that connected him to the outside world, was no longer passable. A massive concrete barrier, gray and rough-edged, now sat firmly across the entrance. It wasn't some temporary construction marker or a half-hearted pile of cinder blocks. It was a monolith, poured and cured in place, seamlessly merging into the edges of the roadway. There were no work crews in sight, no city trucks, no warning signs. Just the hulking block of concrete and, screwed into its side, a metal placard that read in bold black letters, "Access restricted until further notice. Contact Community Management for resolution." Nick set down his coffee cup carefully. He walked down the steps, crossed the yard, and approached the barrier. The realization hit him immediately. This wasn't just vandalism or some prank. This was premeditated. Whoever had done this had used industrial equipment to pour the form, likely overnight. They had taken the time to cure it properly, anchor it into the ground, and affix an official-looking sign to lend it an air of authority. It wasn't just meant to block him, it was meant to intimidate him. He stood there for a long moment, the early morning sun casting long shadows over the rough surface of the concrete. Nick was many things, but impulsive wasn't one of them. He didn't pick up the phone to start yelling at the committee. He didn't post angry rants on social media. Instead, he turned on his heel, went back into the house, retrieved his phone, and began documenting everything in precise detail. Wide shots, close-ups, measurements, time-stamped videos. He made sure to capture the location of the barrier relative to his property lines, the absence of any construction notices, the way it blocked emergency access completely. Then he called his attorney and calmly explained the situation. While waiting for a callback, Nick walked the perimeter of his land. His mind wasn't racing with panic. It was working methodically, assembling the steps he would need to take next. Contact emergency services, he thought, not just to complain, but to file an official hazard report. Notify the fire department that his property was now inaccessible to fire trucks or ambulances. File a formal grievance with the local municipal council regarding obstruction of a residential roadway. Involve every authority that had jurisdiction over safety and public access, because unlike petty power struggles, real dangers brought real consequences. He knew one thing for certain. Whoever had authorized this act of aggression thought he would fold under pressure. They assumed the inconvenience, the legal complexity, the sheer absurdity of it all would wear him down. But Nick wasn't going to play by their expectations. He had a different plan in mind, one that didn't involve shouting matches or lawsuits dragged out over years. He would find a way to turn their arrogance against them, to make their heavy-handed tactics backfire in a way that no amount of community meetings or scolding letters could undo. The concrete wall that now blocked his driveway wasn't the end of the fight. It was the beginning. Nick didn't waste time pondering the absurdity of the situation. He understood the game was no longer about principle alone. It had escalated into a direct attempt to break his will and force compliance through physical means. By noon that same day, Nick had already initiated 3 separate complaints. One to the fire marshal's office citing the obstruction of emergency vehicle access, another to the county's public works department regarding illegal modification of the roadway, and a third to the municipal code enforcement division concerning unauthorized construction. He wasn't naive enough to believe that the wheels of bureaucracy would turn swiftly, but he knew how to apply pressure where it mattered. Hazards, especially those that could result in lawsuits against the city if left unaddressed, had a way of forcing action. He framed his complaints carefully, not as personal grievances but as matters of public safety, backed by photographic evidence and legal property descriptions. That evening, as he reviewed the footage captured by his home security cameras, Nick made a chilling discovery. Sometime between 2 and 4 a.m., a flatbed truck had rolled up silently to the mouth of his driveway. In the low-resolution night vision footage, several individuals wearing dark uniforms and reflective vests could be seen working methodically around the site. They set up portable floodlights, masked the operation under the guise of official work, and poured the concrete with shocking efficiency. At no point did they knock on his door, leave notices, or provide any form of warning. The footage made it clear. This wasn't an authorized city crew. It was a private operation carried out under the cover of darkness to avoid confrontation or scrutiny. Nick forwarded the footage to his attorney without hesitation. This wasn't a simple neighborly dispute anymore. This was targeted, coordinated action designed to isolate and coerce. The next morning, Nick's lawyer returned his call with a mixture of anger and amusement in her voice. She explained that whoever had orchestrated this move had made a critical legal error. By obstructing the only ingress and egress point to a private residence without lawful authority, they had not only committed a civil infraction, but potentially opened themselves up to criminal liability for unlawful interference and endangerment. Bolstered by the legal opinion, Nick began planning his next move, but he also understood he needed to remain measured. Acting too rashly could provide ammunition for the committee to paint him as unstable or unreasonable. Instead, he focused on gathering support quietly. He contacted a licensed civil engineer he had worked with years earlier and requested a full inspection and report on the obstruction's impact on his property value, safety, and accessibility. If he was going to dismantle this illegal barrier, he would do it with overwhelming documentation backing every step. Meanwhile, the committee, emboldened by Nick's silence, escalated their psychological campaign. Nick started receiving thinly veiled notices from supposed community compliance officers, claiming that his lawn was non-compliant with seasonal maintenance standards. Flyers offering remediation services were stuffed into his mailbox daily, each bearing the same pastel-colored header favored by the committee. Nick smiled grimly at the pettiness. These tactics weren't designed to enforce rules. They were designed to exhaust him mentally and emotionally. It was pressure through attrition, death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. Karen Miller, never one to miss a performance opportunity, made a point of walking her oversized golden retriever past Nick's property twice a day. She would slow down near the driveway, sometimes waving grandly at the massive barrier as if admiring a newly erected statue. Nick watched from his porch more than once as Karen exchanged hushed, gleeful conversations with other committee loyalists across the street, pointing toward his home and laughing behind cupped hands. Nick refused to engage. He didn't storm down to the barrier with a sledgehammer. He didn't shout at Karen from across the lawn. He knew the real war wasn't won through outbursts. It was won by stripping the enemy of their legitimacy piece by piece until they collapsed under the weight of their own arrogance. Within a week, small cracks in the committee's position began to appear. A letter arrived from the county fire marshal's office, formally notifying the homeowners committee that an emergency access review had been initiated. The wording was careful but firm. Failure to restore unobstructed access to all residential properties could result in substantial daily fines, legal action, and liability in the event of any incident requiring emergency response. Separately, a code enforcement officer contacted Nick directly to schedule an inspection of the barrier site. Even if slow, the system was grinding forward. Nick's attorney also filed an emergency petition in county court seeking an injunction to force the removal of the barrier. While it would take time for a hearing date to be set, simply filing the action placed the committee on official notice that legal escalation was underway. That alone shifted the tone of the neighborhood dynamic. Neighbors who had previously looked away now hesitated before crossing the street. Some offered awkward nods or averted their gazes entirely when passing Nick's house. Fear was setting in. Not fear of Nick, but fear of what a public scandal could mean for property values, reputations, and the cozy little power structure the committee had cultivated for years. Still, Nick understood that bureaucratic wheels turned slowly, and while legal processes played out, he remained trapped. Work was harder to get to, supply deliveries had to be rerouted, and even trash pickup became an ordeal. It would be months before the courts might force a solution, and Nick had no intention of waiting quietly while his life was held hostage by the petty tyranny of suburban overlords. Late one night, as he reviewed yet another set of property diagrams and legal notes under the dim light of his study, an idea began to crystallize. It wasn't rage or frustration that fueled it. Those emotions had long since cooled into something sharper and more deliberate. Nick realized that while the committee had trapped him physically, they had inadvertently exposed themselves. They had built a fortress of arrogance atop a foundation of assumptions, and now he would bring it down not with lawsuits or angry protests, but with the very tools they had weaponized against him. He didn't need permission to clear his own driveway. He didn't even need to tear the barrier apart piece by piece. What he needed was precision, the right equipment, and the patience to do it in a way that left no legal opening for retaliation. His plan wouldn't be about destruction. It would be about redirection, a simple transfer of property from where it didn't belong to where it would cause the most pain. Nick spent the next few days making quiet arrangements. Through a network of old professional contacts, he located a crane operator willing to take a private job under tight confidentiality. The man didn't ask many questions once Nick explained the basics. No heavy demolition, just a lift-and-move operation conducted during off-peak hours. Nick also obtained the necessary permits for temporary equipment use, framing it as a private property improvement project to avoid attracting attention. Legally, he was fully within his rights to remove an obstruction from his own driveway. When the crane arrived late on a cool Saturday evening, Nick directed the operation with the calm precision of a man setting a final piece in a long-played game. The barrier, as massive as it was, posed no serious challenge to the hydraulic strength of modern equipment. Chains were fastened, anchors tested, and with a low mechanical groan, the concrete slab lifted from its unlawful resting place like an ancient monolith being unearthed. Nick didn't just move it a few feet. He transported the barrier nearly a mile down the quiet neighborhood roads, his escort vehicle flashing slow-moving signs and hazard lights. The few neighbors who witnessed the strange procession watched in stunned silence from their windows, too bewildered to intervene. When they arrived at the heart of the community, the clubhouse parking lot, Nick directed the crane operator to set the concrete slab precisely across the main entrance to the clubhouse's front doors. It landed with a satisfying, echoing thud. The move was deliberate and symbolic. The clubhouse, a structure that the committee prided itself on as the centerpiece of community life, was now inaccessible, just as they had tried to cut off Nick's home from the outside world. Nick paid the operator, shook his hand, and quietly returned home under the cover of darkness. No grand speeches, no gloating. His statement was made not in words, but in weight, literally and figuratively. By morning, the community would wake to find that the power they thought they wielded had been turned back against them, not with anger or vandalism, but with lawful, surgical precision. The battle was no longer just about Nick's driveway. It was about who controlled the rules and who had the courage to stand when others cowered. The reaction from the committee was as immediate as it was predictable. By early morning, Nick could hear the hum of angry voices echoing down the road. He stayed inside, sipping his coffee at the kitchen window, watching from a distance as Karen Miller and a small cluster of her loyalists gathered around the newly planted concrete monument blocking their precious clubhouse. They gestured wildly, some of them pulling at the edges of the barrier in vain, as if they could move it with sheer outrage. Nick noted with a quiet satisfaction how the very tactic they had used to isolate him had now turned inward, paralyzing their own operations. He had returned their message in kind, but unlike them, he had done so legally, methodically, and with undeniable finality. There was no one they could call to haul it away without admitting their own culpability for the mess that had started it all. By noon, Karen was pacing up and down the street, barking orders into her phone. Nick could only imagine the nature of those conversations. Pleas to the local council, threats toward the crane operator, desperate bargaining with contractors. But none of that mattered now. The damage had been done, and not just physically. Nick had shattered the committee's illusion of control. They were used to dealing with frightened homeowners who folded under pressure, who paid the fines just to avoid the headache. They weren't equipped to handle someone who fought back not with vandalism or rage, but with precise, cold strategy. Later that afternoon, a professionally printed letter appeared taped to Nick's front door. It bore the header of the committee and was written in bold, officious language. It accused Nick of reckless endangerment, unauthorized use of heavy machinery within residential zones, and creating a public hazard. It demanded immediate removal of the barrier from community property and threatened civil action if compliance was not achieved within 72 hours. Nick read the letter carefully, chuckling at the clumsy legal threats sprinkled throughout the text. He scanned it, filed it with the growing pile of documentation on his desk, and made a mental note to forward it to his attorney first thing Monday morning. He knew the letter had no real teeth. It was nothing more than another bluff, another attempt to intimidate him into surrender. But Nick understood that Karen wouldn't stop there. For people like her, public humiliation was a wound that couldn't be ignored. Pride demanded retaliation, and pride, when wounded, made people reckless. That night, as Nick secured his property and double-checked the locks on his gates, he prepared himself for the next wave. This wouldn't end with letters or shouting matches. Karen would escalate, and when she did, she would overreach. The first sign came 2 days later when construction cones mysteriously appeared along the road leading to Nick's property. Large signs declared that emergency infrastructure improvements were underway and that access was restricted to authorized vehicles only. There were no city logos, no official notices filed with the municipal department, just handmade signs, slapped together in a rush. Nick didn't need an engineer's eye to recognize that the supposed construction was nothing more than sabotage. Trenches were dug hastily across the road, piles of gravel were dumped carelessly at intervals, and in some places the asphalt had been deliberately broken apart with jackhammers. The route to his home had been turned into a minefield of obstacles, designed not to repair but to block and frustrate. Nick acted immediately. He photographed every inch of the damage, paying particular attention to the lack of safety barriers, missing permits, and the obvious hazards left in plain view. He sent the evidence to his attorney, the fire marshal, and the Municipal Code Enforcement Office. He even contacted the city's Public Works Department anonymously, tipping them off to illegal construction activity occurring without proper authorization. Within 24 hours, an inspector arrived on site, clipboard in hand, frowning deeply as he surveyed the chaos. The inspector's report was brutal. It cited multiple violations, including unauthorized alteration of a public roadway, failure to maintain proper safety standards, and obstruction of emergency routes. Fines were issued not to Nick but to the homeowners committee directly, with escalating penalties if the road was not restored within 2 weeks. Nick watched from his porch as Karen received the news from the inspector. Her face, usually a mask of smug superiority, contorted into a mixture of disbelief and barely contained rage. She argued, waved papers in the air, demanded to speak to supervisors, but it was useless. The system she had manipulated for so long was now grinding her under its wheels. But Karen wasn't finished. In a last-ditch effort to regain control, she organized a so-called emergency meeting of the committee, inviting select residents to a gathering in a rented tent hastily erected on a neighboring property. Flyers were distributed throughout the community, painting Nick as a dangerous agitator, accusing him of endangering the welfare of the neighborhood and disrespecting communal values. The language was inflammatory, designed to whip up fear and resentment among those who barely knew the full story. Nick, of course, was not invited to the meeting, but he didn't need to be. Word traveled quickly, and within hours, sympathetic neighbors quietly informed him of what was said. According to multiple sources, Karen had framed the conflict not as a dispute over property rights, but as a moral failing, an outsider who refused to integrate and cooperate with community standards. She called him a threat to neighborhood cohesion, a rogue element that needed to be managed before he attracted the wrong type of attention. Nick didn't respond publicly. He didn't attend the meeting, didn't storm the tent or shout back. Instead, he allowed Karen to dig her own grave. Every accusation she made, every half-truth she spread, only further revealed her desperation to those with eyes to see. The quieter Nick remained, the more unhinged she appeared by contrast. Behind the scenes, Nick's legal case continued to build momentum. His attorney had compiled a devastating portfolio of evidence, including video footage of the illegal barrier installation, photographs of the sabotaged road, copies of threatening letters, and sworn statements from residents who had witnessed the harassment firsthand. The case wasn't just about Nick's property anymore. It was about exposing the systemic abuse of power that the committee had exercised unchecked for years. The pressure finally reached a boiling point when, during a city council meeting unrelated to Nick's case, a concerned citizen raised a question about the committee's unauthorized construction activities. Council members, already aware of the ongoing investigations, could no longer ignore the matter. An inquiry was formally launched into the Homeowners Committee's financial practices, governance procedures, and use of municipal property. Karen's house of cards began to collapse with stunning speed. Financial irregularities surfaced, unapproved expenditures, misappropriated maintenance funds, sweetheart contracts awarded to friends and relatives. Records showed that Karen had authorized several large payments to companies with no verified credentials for community improvements that never materialized. Public trust evaporated almost overnight. Residents who had once supported her turned away, disgusted by the corruption and mismanagement now laid bare for all to see. Nick remained on the sidelines, observing the downfall with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew he had fought the right fight in the right way. He hadn't needed to shout or scheme or vandalize. He had simply stood his ground, applied the law like a scalpel, and let the truth do the heavy lifting. As Karen faced mounting legal and civic pressure, her visits past Nick's property ceased. The golden retriever walks stopped. The late-night surveillance drives ended. It was as if the very neighborhood had swallowed her up, erasing her presence from its streets. The barrier in front of the clubhouse remained untouched for weeks, a silent monument to her hubris and Nick's quiet defiance. Nick understood that the battle wasn't completely over. Bureaucracies, like wounded animals, sometimes lashed out before dying. But the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The community had seen the truth. The authorities had been activated, and Karen's empire was crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance. In the end, Nick didn't need to celebrate or gloat. His greatest victory was the return of normalcy, the ability to walk out his front door, breathe freely, and live without the constant shadow of petty tyranny hanging over him. The war for his driveway had been won, not with fists or fury, but with patience, precision, and an unshakable refusal to bow. As the weeks dragged on, the aftermath of Karen's collapse became more visible with each passing day, though Nick kept himself carefully distanced from the spectacle. He continued his quiet routines, restoring small details around his property that had been neglected during the chaos. The garden needed tending, the gutters needed clearing, but even while his hands were busy, his mind remained sharp, tracking every shift in the community's mood like a seasoned strategist monitoring a battlefield. No one approached him directly. There were no apologies, no grand gestures of reconciliation. Instead, there was the cautious reestablishment of normal neighborly courtesies, a polite wave from across the street, a brief greeting at the mailbox, a nod of acknowledgement as people passed by. It was a language Nick understood well. Nobody wanted to openly discuss the scandal, but silently, they were signaling that he was no longer viewed as the enemy. The concrete barrier, the symbol of everything that had spiraled so far out of control, still lay lodged across the clubhouse's entrance, its hulking presence now more of an embarrassment than a statement. No one dared touch it. The committee, what little remained of it after resignations and public disgrace, was paralyzed by the fear of attracting more attention. Removing it would require admitting fault. Leaving it there was a daily reminder of their defeat. Nick often found himself glancing at it when driving past, not with gloating satisfaction, but with the cold clarity of a man who understood the importance of symbols. It wasn't about winning some petty feud. It was about making it impossible for the system that tried to crush him to pretend nothing had happened. Yet even with the major battle seemingly over, Nick remained cautious. He knew better than to assume that entrenched powers surrendered completely. Systems adapted, morphed, found new ways to reassert control if given the chance. That understanding shaped his next steps. He didn't dismantle the network of support he had built during the ordeal. Instead, he quietly reinforced it, maintaining contact with the municipal inspectors who had handled the investigations, sending friendly follow-ups to his lawyer to keep the pressure alive, and staying informed about the movements of the remnants of the committee through public records and meeting notices. Victory wasn't a single moment. It was vigilance sustained over time. It was during one of those quiet afternoons while reading over municipal council bulletins online that Nick stumbled upon an interesting announcement. The city had officially rescinded the special administrative privileges once granted to the community's association. Without those privileges, the homeowners' committee lost their ability to impose fees, enforce aesthetic standards, or regulate property use beyond the limits already set by city ordinance. In effect, the committee was rendered powerless, a hollow shell of bureaucracy with no teeth. Nick leaned back in his chair, absorbing the weight of the news. It wasn't just Karen who had fallen. The very structure that enabled her tyranny had been dismantled, stone by stone, regulation by regulation, through the slow but relentless application of law and fact. Still, he didn't celebrate publicly. He understood how fragile such victories could be if they became points of pride rather than foundations of stability. Instead, he turned his attention to rebuilding, not his property, which had remained intact, but the fabric of community life around him. Quietly, he volunteered for a municipal advisory board, one focused on rural infrastructure and safety standards. He attended meetings without fanfare, speaking only when necessary, offering the practical insights of someone who had lived through the consequences of bureaucratic neglect and overreach. Nick had no interest in becoming a political figure or a neighborhood hero. His motivations were simpler, ensuring that no one else would have to fight the kind of battle he had fought, not if proper oversight and sensible regulations were maintained. Through this subtle re-engagement, Nick began to notice a gradual shift in how others regarded him. Where once there had been suspicion and avoidance, now there was a kind of grudging respect. People understood, even if they didn't say it aloud, that he hadn't sought conflict for conflict's sake. He had stood his ground when it mattered, using intelligence and patience rather than anger and chaos. In a world where so many folded under pressure, Nick had shown that resistance was still possible, and that it could be carried out without becoming the very thing one opposed. Ironically, it was the concrete barrier, still lying across the abandoned clubhouse, that catalyzed the final movement toward closure. An informal group of residents, tired of the unsightly monument and embarrassed by its continued presence, petitioned the city to have it removed. Nick watched the debates unfold from a distance, declining to involve himself directly. He had made his point months ago. Now it was the community's turn to reckon with its consequences. Eventually, the city agreed to remove the barrier at public expense, treating it as an abandoned obstruction rather than community property. Municipal workers arrived one morning with industrial equipment, dismantling the concrete block piece by piece and hauling it away. No ceremony, no speeches, just quiet, methodical work, as if erasing a bad memory. Nick stood at his kitchen window sipping coffee as he had on the morning when it all began, and watched the final remnants disappear down the street. He didn't feel triumph. He felt something far more valuable. Vindication. His stand hadn't just protected his driveway. It had forced a system built on complacency and intimidation to confront its own rot. It had shown that resilience, properly applied, could outlast even the most entrenched forms of petty authoritarianism. In the weeks that followed, Nick resumed his life with an ease that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. He focused on his small business, expanding his equipment fleet modestly. He took long walks through the now quiet streets, greeted neighbors without tension, and reclaimed the peaceful existence that had drawn him to the community in the first place. He also made subtle upgrades to his property, more security cameras, better lighting, reinforced gate locks, not out of paranoia, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the lessons hard won. When new residents moved into nearby houses, Nick welcomed them politely but cautiously, offering neighborly advice without entangling himself in their affairs. He had no interest in building a new empire or becoming a local celebrity. He valued what he had fought for too much to risk it again through ego or carelessness. His home was his sanctuary, and he intended to protect it with the same quiet, patient strength that had carried him through the worst the committee had thrown at him. In the end, Nick understood something few ever learned before it was too late. Real power didn't come from rules written on paper or votes taken in secret meetings. It came from the willingness to endure, to stand firm against pressure, to outlast those who mistook intimidation for authority. He hadn't needed to destroy anyone to win. He had only needed to make it impossible for them to destroy him. That was the true victory, and it was a victory no one could ever take away. Nick had settled into the rhythm of his restored peace when the first signs of deeper trouble emerged. Not from the remnants of the old committee, which had by now all but dissolved, but from a more dangerous and less predictable source. The new property management company hired by the city to oversee the formerly self-governed neighborhood. In the void left behind by the disbanded committee, the city council had voted to outsource community oversight to a private firm specializing in suburban management. On paper, it seemed like a logical solution: neutral, professional, free from local politics. In practice, it brought an entirely new set of problems, ones less theatrical than Karen's petty tyranny but far more insidious and systematic. The management company, operating under the sanitized banner of Community Renewal Services, began their work quietly. At first, they issued benign notices about trash pickup schedules, park maintenance updates, and upcoming roadwork. Nick read these bulletins with mild disinterest, recognizing them for the bureaucratic noise they were. But within a month, the tone shifted. New regulations appeared in the mail, documents listing minor infractions punishable by escalating fines, requirements for landscaping uniformity, restrictions on the types of vehicles allowed to park in driveways, mandates for the aesthetic harmony of property facades. Each new rule was framed as a way to preserve property values and enhance community appeal. None of it had been discussed publicly. None of it had been voted on by residents. At first, Nick thought little of it. His property, as always, was meticulously maintained, and he had long since learned the importance of documentation. But when he received a warning notice accusing him of violating the new driveway vehicle standards because his work truck, a perfectly clean and registered pickup used for transporting rental equipment, was deemed unsightly, he realized this was not a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of a new siege, one more subtle but just as oppressive as the one he had already survived. The warning came with a fine, $250, escalating by $50 each week if unaddressed. Nick immediately contested it through the company's dispute process, submitting photos and documentation showing that his truck was legally parked, fully operational, and did not block sidewalks or roadways. He expected reason to prevail. Instead, he received a curt reply stating that the decision had been reviewed and upheld, citing vague clauses about neighborhood standards that had never been voted on by the residents. It was clear. The new management company had adopted a strategy of attrition, leveraging minor technicalities to extract revenue through fear and compliance. Nick suspected he wasn't alone, and informal conversations with neighbors confirmed it. Elderly residents were receiving citations for overgrown grass that measured barely an inch above arbitrary limits. Families were fined for having holiday decorations up past designated removal dates. The old tyranny of Karen had been personal and emotional. This new one was cold, professional, and profit-driven. Nick knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. Unlike the old committee, this entity was a corporate machine backed by legal departments and shielded by contracts. But he also knew that bureaucracy, once weaponized against people, could be made to turn against itself if pressed correctly. His first move was to initiate a Freedom of Information Act request with the city, demanding access to the contract under which community renewal services operated. It took weeks, but eventually the documents arrived. What he found confirmed his suspicions. The management company's compensation structure included incentive bonuses tied directly to the amount of fines collected from residents. Armed with this information, Nick quietly rallied a small group of neighbors, those who had also been targeted, who were tired of the endless notices and escalating fees. They met not in public halls or under tents, but informally, in living rooms and backyards, building a coalition of the willing. Their goal was simple: to gather enough documented abuses to present a formal grievance to the city council and force a review of the company's contract. While the coalition grew, the management company doubled down on their tactics. Nick's property became a particular target. Inspectors arrived weekly, measuring his lawn with tape measures, photographing his driveway from multiple angles, peering over his fences. Notices became increasingly absurd. Citations for visible garden tools, non-compliant trash bin placement, improper lighting fixtures. Each notice came with a fine, each fine a new insult to his patience. Yet Nick didn't react emotionally. He documented everything, every visit, every notice, every conversation, with the cold precision of a man who had learned that survival depended not on anger, but on relentless preparation. Meanwhile, the situation began drawing wider attention. Local journalists, tipped off anonymously by members of Nick's coalition, started sniffing around. Articles appeared questioning the rise in neighborhood citations citywide, highlighting cases of elderly homeowners driven to tears by predatory fines. Nick stayed in the background, refusing interviews, letting the momentum build without painting a target on his back. The turning point came when the city council, facing mounting public pressure, scheduled a special hearing to review the complaints. Residents packed the council chambers, many clutching folders thick with citation notices, photographs, and correspondence. Nick watched from the sidelines as speaker after speaker recounted stories of harassment, financial pressure, and the erosion of community trust. The testimonies were raw, emotional, and, most importantly, backed by evidence. When Nick's turn came, he didn't deliver a fiery speech. Instead, he calmly laid out the case he had been building for months: the incentive structures that rewarded predatory behavior, the lack of transparency in rule creation, the absence of democratic oversight. He presented charts, timelines, contract excerpts. He spoke not as an agitator, but as a citizen demanding accountability. The council members, now fully aware of the political stakes, reacted swiftly. They voted unanimously to suspend Community Renewal Services Authority pending a full audit. A city-appointed oversight committee was established to draft new community guidelines with direct resident input. And perhaps most importantly, the city announced that all fines issued over the past 6 months would be reviewed and potentially voided if found unjustified. Nick didn't smile as he left the council chambers. He felt no elation, no triumphant surge of victory. He felt only the steady, grounded satisfaction of a man who understood that real change was slow, grueling, and never fully complete. He had fought not just one tyrant, but two. One petty and personal, the other faceless and corporate, and he had survived them both without compromising his principles. Returning home that evening, Nick paused at the end of his now unobstructed driveway, the familiar gravel crunching under his boots. The house stood silent and solid before him, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. For a moment he allowed himself a rare smile, not for the battles won, but for the simple, enduring truth they proved. Freedom, once taken for granted, must sometimes be fought for not with grand gestures, but with patience, resilience, and an unyielding commitment to doing what is right, no matter how long it takes or how many obstacles are placed in the way. He had not chosen this fight. It had come to him, as such fights often do, unwanted and at great personal cost. But he had chosen how to fight it, and in that choice he had found something deeper than victory. He had found his place, not just on a piece of land at the edge of a forgotten suburb, but within the enduring spirit of those who refuse to be broken, who refuse to bow, who stand even when standing alone. The weeks that followed the City Council's suspension of community renewal services were not filled with dramatic reversals or swift triumphs. They were instead marked by a slow, grinding realignment of power, a gradual unwinding of the carefully hidden structures that had allowed the exploitation of residents to thrive unchecked. Nick watched it all unfold from his quiet vantage point, rarely speaking unless necessary, refusing to become the face of the movement even as many in the community privately credited him with sparking the change. He hadn't done it for recognition. He had done it to protect his home, to defend the principle that individuals should not be ground down under the weight of petty authoritarianism, whether that authority wore the face of an embittered neighbor or the sanitized corporate mask of a management company. The formal audit revealed what many had suspected but few had dared to believe in full. Under the guise of enhancing community standards, Community Renewal Services had implemented over 200 unapproved regulations, collected hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines, and engaged in systematic practices of selective enforcement, designed to target residents who were less likely to fight back. Elderly homeowners, single parents, and working-class families had borne the brunt of the predatory system. Many had paid without protest, too intimidated by the threat of legal action or foreclosure to contest the fines. Faced with overwhelming evidence, the City Council had little choice but to act decisively. The management company's contract was terminated, their local executives barred from operating in the jurisdiction pending further legal review. Civil lawsuits loomed on the horizon. At the same time, the council passed a series of emergency ordinances stripping any future management firms of unilateral enforcement power, mandating that all new regulations be approved by direct vote of residents. It was a systemic correction, the kind that rarely occurred without prolonged suffering and extraordinary persistence. For Nick, the culmination of these efforts was not a public parade or a ceremony. It was an evening, much like any other, where he sat on his porch as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, listening to the soft rustle of the wind through the trees and the distant hum of a world that, for once, was not arrayed against him. He had not set out to dismantle a system. He had only sought to defend his small piece of ground, to preserve the freedom he had worked so hard to build. But in fighting for himself, he had inadvertently helped to free many others trapped in the same silent war. Yet even as the external battle drew to a close, Nick understood that real victory required vigilance. Power, once removed from one set of hands, inevitably sought new vessels. Ambition, greed, the quiet hunger for control, they were not vanquished by a single battle, no matter how complete. They lay dormant, waiting for the next opportunity to assert themselves. It was a truth Nick had seen too often to ignore. He applied the lesson pragmatically. Rather than retreating into comfortable complacency, he remained quietly involved with the newly formed Community Advisory Board. He attended meetings, listened carefully, and spoke only when necessary to guide discussions back to principles of fairness, transparency, and resident empowerment. His role was not that of a leader or a crusader. He positioned himself instead as a guardian of process, a reminder that the price of freedom was eternal attention to the slow encroachments of unaccountable authority. Still, there were moments when the gravity of what had been achieved settled over him with full weight. One such evening came when he received an unexpected visitor, an elderly woman who lived 2 streets over, a resident he barely knew, knocked on his door, holding a homemade pie wrapped clumsily in foil. She didn't offer a speech of gratitude or launch into a long story. She simply pressed the pie into his hands, smiled faintly, and said, "You stood up when the rest of us couldn't." Then she turned and left without waiting for a response. Nick stood in his doorway for a long moment, the simple gesture burning deeper into his heart than any grand proclamation ever could. He understood then, in a way he hadn't fully before, that resistance was not only about protecting oneself but about creating the possibility for others to stand again once fear no longer pinned them down. The community slowly began to heal. Relationships strained by fear and distrust started to mend. Holiday decorations returned to front lawns without fear of citation. Kids played freely in the parks without parents anxiously watching for rule enforcers with clipboards. The very atmosphere of the neighborhood shifted, from one of a cautious submission to a cautious hope that perhaps, finally, they were free to live without the suffocating hand of micromanaged governance pressing against their backs. Nick took satisfaction not in the collapse of the structures that had sought to control him, but in the resilience of the simple, everyday life he and his neighbors could now enjoy. A life of small, honest liberties, hanging a flag without a permit, parking a pickup truck without harassment, planting a garden without an approved plan. Rights that had seemed insignificant until they were taken away, only to be recognized later for what they truly were, the foundation stones of freedom. He kept a careful distance from local politics, mindful of how quickly the tides could turn. He didn't want a seat on any board or a title next to his name. His satisfaction came from quieter victories. A repaired fence, a mended driveway, a freshly planted oak tree in the front yard that would, if left undisturbed, stand long after he was gone. Symbols not of conquest, but of endurance. There were occasional setbacks, of course. Bureaucracies never died, they mutated. But now the residents were watchful. They had seen what unchecked authority could become, and they had seen that it could be fought. When new management proposals surfaced, they were met not with blind trust but with rigorous scrutiny. When new rules were suggested, they were debated openly, challenged, amended. Into the fear that had once silenced dissent had been replaced with a cautious but growing confidence in collective strength. Nick understood that he had played a role in that change, even if most would never know the full extent of what he had endured or how deliberately he had fought. And that was enough. He had reclaimed his home, not just the land and the house, but the idea of it, the principle that it was a place where he could live by the fruits of his own labor, answerable only to the laws that governed all, not to the whims of petty tyrants, cloaked in official titles. As he sat on his porch one evening, a slight breeze carrying the scent of cut grass and distant barbecues, Nick reflected on the strange, twisting path that had brought him to this moment. He had faced walls of concrete and walls of bureaucracy, had endured isolation, harassment, and legal threats. He had been painted as a villain and then quietly vindicated. Through it all, he had learned that the real battles were not fought in courts or council chambers or even across driveways, but within the soul. The battle to remain steadfast when giving in would be easier. to remain principled when anger would, offer a quicker release to remain patient when urgency demanded action. Nick smiled slightly, not with triumph, but with the hard-won peace of a man who knew he had faced the worst and had not broken. His home was quiet, the streets were calm, and for now, at least, freedom reigned not because it had been granted, but because it had been taken back and defended inch by inch, quietly, relentlessly, until those who sought to rule understood they were outmatched not by force but by sheer, immovable will. Months slipped by like the quiet turning of pages in a well-worn book, and the fierce battles that once consumed Nick's world became distant echoes, their weight gradually fading but never entirely forgotten. Life in the community settled into a rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar in its simplicity. There were no sudden inspections, no surprise notices taped to doors, no whispered threats disguised as neighborly advice. For the first time since he had moved into the neighborhood, Nick lived exactly as he had intended, quietly, freely, with no one intruding into the space he had carved out for himself through patience, endurance, and sheer, unbreakable will. The new oversight structure, while not perfect, operated transparently and without the aggressive posture of its predecessors. Rules, when proposed, were discussed openly. Votes were taken publicly. There were no hidden agendas, no sudden regulations dropped into mailboxes in the dead of night. Most importantly, the residents had learned to recognize the early signs of overreach and were quick to challenge anything that even hinted at the old ways. Nick attended meetings only occasionally, speaking sparingly and only when necessary to reinforce the principles he knew were easily forgotten when comfort returned: accountability, fairness, and the unwavering right of individuals to live without fear of arbitrary control. The house itself, his refuge and battlefield both, bore few visible scars from the struggle that had once raged around it. If anything, it stood prouder, a quiet testament to the battle fought and won not with noise, but with relentless determination. Nick continued to improve it, not in grand or ostentatious ways, but through steady, thoughtful work. A reinforced gate here, a new layer of gravel on the driveway there, small acts of preservation that together symbolized something much greater: permanence. He understood now more deeply than ever that freedom was not a condition to be achieved once and celebrated endlessly. It was a discipline, a practice maintained through constant vigilance and quiet strength. Occasionally, Nick would see remnants of the old committee's loyalists around town, faces that once glared at him with barely concealed hostility, now lowered or turned away entirely. There were no apologies offered, and Nick expected none. True contrition, he knew, was rare. What mattered was not the absence of apology, but the absence of power, their inability to ever again wield their petty authority against those who refused to submit. Karen herself had vanished almost entirely from local life. Rumors abounded that she had moved out of embarrassment, that she faced civil suits, that she lived now in quiet, bitter exile a few towns over. Nick spared her little thought. She had made her choices, as had he, and both now lived with the consequences. On a crisp autumn evening, Nick found himself standing once again at the edge of his property, hands resting lightly on the cool steel of the new front gate he had installed himself. The oak tree he had planted months before now stretched its slender branches upward, its leaves rustling faintly in the breeze. He thought of how fragile it had looked at first, barely more than a stick in the dirt, and how quickly it had rooted itself, how stubbornly it had grown in spite of storms and drought. It seemed a fitting symbol for everything that had transpired, the understanding that strength was not about size or noise, but about depth, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to stand. As he watched the last light fade over the hills, Nick reflected on the strange, quiet satisfaction that came not from defeating an enemy, but from enduring long enough to watch them exhaust themselves against the immovable force of principle. He had not changed himself to suit the system. He had forced the system to acknowledge his right to exist without compromise. It was a small victory, perhaps, measured against the grand struggles of the world, but to Nick, it meant everything. It was a reminder that even when outnumbered, even when pressured from every side, a man who knew where he stood and refused to be moved could still carve out a space of peace, a small sanctuary against the endless tide of control and conformity. He turned back toward the house, the porch light casting a warm glow over the neatly swept steps and the sturdy front door. Inside, the quiet hum of life awaited him, a home built not just of wood and stone, but of battles fought and lessons learned. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring, new challenges, new tests of patience and will, but for tonight, Nick allowed himself a rare moment of ease, a brief but profound acknowledgement of everything he had endured and everything he had preserved. In the end, the concrete barriers and citation letters, the angry meetings and petty threats, all faded into irrelevance against the simple, enduring truth he had proven beyond doubt. That a man's home, when guarded with patience, courage, and unwavering resolve, could remain his castle no matter how many times the world tried to siege its walls. And so, with the night settling in around him and the future wide open before him, Nick Hunt closed the gate behind him, the latch clicking home with a solid, satisfying finality, and stepped inside, free, unbroken, and utterly at peace in the place he had fought so hard to call his own.